Hello and welcome to another Dungeons and Dragons rant, story time, whatever this is. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of stories, but for the most part this is about the dangers of homebrew. Now I'm going to preface this, I'm not saying all homebrew is bad. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad, and there's a lot of in the middle. I've done homebrew, I homebrew all the time. In the campaign that I'm doing now, the first enemy my characters fought was completely homebrew. It was the mannequins called blanks. They were completely homebrew. I used other monster stats, but I twisted them and made them into my own creature. That's good homebrew. Well, to an extent. But there is a lot of dangerous homebrew. The first thing that comes to mind is one of the campaigns. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 sessions. But the main problem I encountered was one of the players. I won't name names. No, it was none of the usual players. This was a player who happened to join us, and he didn't play along with us. But he almost exclusively wanted to play homebrew. I believe it was his first time playing too, and he did not want to play anything in the books. I offered everything I had, and he's like, "No, I want to play this." Now he played. This is before Artificer came out, which I don't remember what book it was in, but this is before it had come out. He wanted to play an Artificer, and he found one on D&D Wiki. I believe that's what it's called. I haven't looked at it in a long time. Now, prior to this, I had been on D&D Wiki. I had looked through it, and there was that's before there was changelings, there was half-phonies, there was other races that, off the top of my head, I can't think of, but there were races that are now integrated into D&D. But back then, before all the books were out, that was how you got some of these classes and races, was through homebrew. He wanted to play a homebrew Artificer. And I read through it, and I was like, okay, I was naive, and this is early on in my D&D life, so I didn't see all the red flags it had. But as we began to play, more and more I realized that this is incredibly overpowered. Like, ridiculously overpowered. He was doing absurd damage. He was creating absurd things. I believe his Artificer, I know, the class he had picked, the subclass in Artificer, allowed him to have a mechanical companion. And this is when things get really bad. He took the homebrew class and said, "Hey, I want to have a homebrew creature." And I was like, "Well, okay, what do you mean?" He's like, "Well, the Artificer class allows me to make a mechanical companion of any creature. I want it to also be a homebrew creature, I think it was like a storm eagle or something." And me being naive and not wanting to say no to my players, I said, "Okay, yeah, that's fine. That'll work." It was the worst decision I've ever made. It completely destroyed the campaign. The campaign fizzled after like 2 sessions after that because he was just too overpowered. Like, I'm talking blowing up buildings, dismantling dungeons. If I recall, they had a quest where they were trying to infiltrate a drug warehouse. He used his abilities to just blow a hole in the wall and kill everybody in there single-handedly. And I'm sitting there thinking, the other players aren't getting to do anything. And at that point, I didn't completely ban homebrew, mind you, but I took a step back and I said, I need to learn more about these homebrews before I allow them. And that's completely on me. I've read through it, but it's one of those situations where you don't know. If you don't know enough, you're going to approve something that in actuality is something that should not. It was way too powerful. Sadly enough, that player didn't play with us anymore because I think once I didn't ban homebrew, but I said, "Hey, you got to play something in the books." He kind of fizzled out, and he just didn't want to play anymore, which I felt bad. But at the same time, I allowing him to play those homebrew monstrosities was unacceptable. It ruined the fun for the other players. Literally, they were doing nothing. They would get into combat, and he would just he would wipe the floor with whatever I threw at them, and they wouldn't even get to do anything. I don't know if I never asked the other players. I never sat down and said, "Hey, is this annoying you?" But I got the feeling when they're not as when they're not as what's the word, involved in the story. They're not picking up on the quest. They're not really in combat. They're like, I do this, okay, that's it. And I got the feeling that they were kind of feeling left out, like they weren't really doing anything. It was all this homebrew artificer. But like I said, that campaign fizzled out after 5 sessions. It did not work. But in a positive light of homebrew, there's a previous video, I homebrewed the Manakee class, which was inherently broken. It had a lot of issues, but it was broken in the way that it's acceptable. The other players didn't mind it. I didn't mind it. The player loved it. But another homebrew story, which I'll tell now, is actually it's not a bad story. This campaign was my second longest running campaign after Death Crew. It came before Death Crew, but it lasted about the second longest until it fizzled out. But there was a player in there. I played with him. He's played with us before. His name's Javon. He's a great guy. This was his first time. Well, it wasn't his first time playing. He had played in some of my Failures to Launch campaigns with his wife at the time. I think the campaign they played in lasted like 1 session. So he came back in this campaign, and he had found something on D&D Wiki. It was a necromancer, but it was like its own inherent class. It wasn't a subclass of wizard. It was literally just a necromancer. And of course, I read through it, and even to this day, I'm not saying like if I read a homebrew, I'll be able to determine if it's overpowered or not. There are extreme cases. If you're dealing like, oh, I deal 500, you know when a bad homebrew is really bad. But these homebrews were balanced enough that I didn't think they were bad. But basically, his necromancer, and the more I think about it, the more I realize this was way too overpowered. He could take any creature above or below a certain CR, challenge rating, and resurrect it as is. No penalties to it. So, for instance, they fought a green hag, or it was either a night hag or green hag, and he resurrected it as a full-fledged green hag. It was under his control, but it had all its abilities, all its spells, all everything. And at that point, I think I realized, like, oh crap, this is really powerful, and I made a mistake. But I found ways around it. I found, for instance, his backstory was connected to another player, Miney. They weren't brothers, but they were both experimented on by a wizard, turned them into, Miney was a sorcerer, wild magic, and he was the necromancer. And that was their background. But one of the things he did was he wanted one of his companions, one of his resurrected followers, to be his real deceased brother, who wasn't overpowered. I think he was your standard zombie, like slam attack, regeneration at the end of its turn, or not at the end of its turn, regeneration. But basically the story behind this is the way I curbed his powers. The class, I'll give it credit, it did have the CR limit, so he could only resurrect certain CR creatures, but the more powerful he got, that CR kept climbing. And it got to a point where I was sitting there thinking, sooner or later, he's going to find something he really wants, and he's going to revive it, and it's going to completely destroy the campaign. Luckily, the campaign fizzled out before that. But what ended up happening was I would not target his creatures, but I would find ways to work around them. The main story, it's a mild, funny story, is they were in the Feywild, and they encountered a large tree surrounded by a banquet. And there were people just shoveling food in their mouth. And long story short, there was a Fey trap, and if you ate the food, you were compelled to continue eating until you stuffed yourself and died. They fought the encounter, destroyed the tree, and I revealed that under the tree was a giant skull. And he was like, ooh, I'm going to go and investigate it. And I'm like, okay, do you touch it? And at the second I said that, of course, red flags and warning signs go off. He's like, you know what, I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to have my green hag zombie touch it. I was like, okay, yeah, that's fine. She touches it and turns into a new tree, a small sapling of the tree you just chopped down. And we all laughed about it, but that was my way of limiting. it was completely off the cuff. I was like, ooh, what happens if they touch this skull? And my mind was like, I'm gonna get rid of this green hag before he decimates something with it. I think it was a night hag because it was more powerful because they had been previously engaged with a night hag. But that's one of the ways I fought around this overpowered class, which I should have never allowed. And to his credit, he never, after that, he stayed away from homebrew. He went more by the books. We didn't, I don't, I think after that campaign, though, I haven't played with him since. There was another failure to launch campaign in which he played a cleric. But that's basically, homebrew, it's dangerous. You have to be very careful with what you allow and what you don't allow. Because obviously you don't want to, if your player comes to you with something that they really want to play, and you read through it, and it's not too bad. Because I mean, D&D Beyond, there's tons of homebrew, and luckily with D&D Beyond, unlike D&D Wiki, D&D Beyond allows user reviews. So you can go through and see, this is blah blah blah, blah 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 says this is too overpowered. This guy says it's too underpowered. This guy says it's perfect. This guy says, hey, tweak this and it's great. But back in the Wild West, when you're sitting there going through D&D Wiki, I'm talking 2016 before D&D Beyond, and you're going through D&D Wiki, you don't have a frame of reference as to what is too overpowered and too weak. And I know I'm ranting, but that's kind of what this whole series is. So I do allow homebrew, but I limit it. And I don't really use homebrew much anymore because most of my players, well, I guess in some situations I allow it. But you have to be very careful. You have to read it carefully. You have to understand it. Take some time, break it down. I'd even say if you have the time, run some scenarios where you take, if it's a homebrew class, you pit it against a monster and you see how it comes out. That's not to the extreme. That's something you can do, but you just have to be careful. And I guess that's all I gotta say. But I mean, I guess in the comments, list a homebrew that you love or a homebrew that you hate, a homebrew that you think should not be allowed, or one that you're like, no, this is so good that I think it should be allowed. Thanks for watching.